In the bustling heart of New York City, where dreams are born and shattered with equal measure, young Emily Thompson hurried through the rain-slicked streets. Her worn sneakers splashed through puddles, each step a reminder of the long journey that had brought her to this moment. At 25, Emily was a vision of determination, her honey blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her blue eyes shining with a mix of hope and trepidation. The neon sign of Luigi's Fine Dining flickered ahead, a beacon in the gathering twilight. Emily took a deep breath, straightened her second-hand blazer, and pushed open the heavy oak door. The smell of garlic and expensive perfume wafted over her as she stepped into the opulent restaurant. "You're late," snapped Veronica, the head waitress, her crimson lips curled in disdain. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't tolerate tardiness." Emily's cheeks flushed. "I'm so sorry, the subway was delayed and—" "Save it," Veronica cut her off. "Just get to work. Table 7 needs their order taken." Swallowing her pride, Emily nodded and made her way to the table. As she approached, she couldn't help but notice the man seated there. Impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his salt and pepper hair perfectly coiffed, he exuded an aura of power and wealth. This was clearly no ordinary customer. "Good evening, sir," Emily said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Welcome to Luigi's. May I take your order?" The man looked up, his steel-gray eyes appraising her with cold calculation. "You're new here," he stated, his tone clipped. "Yes, sir. It's my first week." He snorted, a sound of derision that made Emily's stomach clench. "Well, let's hope you're more competent than you look. I'll have the lobster thermidor and a bottle of your finest Chateau Margaux." Emily jotted down the order, her hand trembling slightly. "Excellent choice, sir. And for your guest?" She gestured to the empty seat across from him. The man's eyes flashed with irritation. "If my guest were here, I would have ordered for them. Your job is to take orders, not ask questions. Now, run along and fetch my wine." Biting back a retort, Emily nodded and turned away, her cheeks burning with humiliation. As she made her way to the kitchen, she could feel the weight of the other diners' stares, their whispers following her like a trail of judgment. In the relative safety of the kitchen, Emily leaned against a cool stainless steel counter, fighting back tears. Chef Marco, a portly man with a kind face, noticed her distress. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly, "don't let them get to you. Some of these folks, they forget what it's like to be human." Emily managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Marco. I need this job so badly. My mom's medical bills." Marco patted her shoulder. I know. You're doing great, Emily. Now, chin up and get that wine to table 7 before Veronica has a conniption." Taking a deep breath, Emily composed herself and headed back out into the dining room, a bottle of exorbitantly priced wine cradled in her arms. As she approached table 7, she noticed the man was now engaged in an intense phone conversation. "Listen, Johnson," he was saying, his voice low and menacing, "I don't care about excuses. If you can't close this deal by tomorrow, you're finished. Do you understand me? Finished." He ended the call just as Emily reached the table. With practiced ease, she presented the wine bottle for his inspection. "Ah, finally," he said, barely glancing at the label before waving his hand dismissively. "Pour it." As Emily carefully uncorked the bottle and began to pour, the man's phone rang again. He answered it brusquely, his attention completely diverted from Emily and her task. It was at that moment that disaster struck. A diner at a nearby table pushed his chair back suddenly, bumping into Emily. The wine bottle slipped from her grasp, seeming to move in slow motion as it tumbled through the air. With a sickening crash, it landed directly in the lap of the powerful man, drenching his expensive suit in deep red wine. The restaurant fell silent, all eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. The man slowly rose to his feet, wine dripping from his ruined clothes, his face a mask of cold fury. "You stupid, incompetent girl," he roared, causing Emily to flinch. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This suit costs more than you'll make in a year." Emily's voice trembled as she tried to apologize. "Sir, I'm so sorry, it was an accident." "An accident?" he sneered. "The only accident here is that someone like you was ever hired to work in an establishment like this. You're nothing but a clumsy, worthless." "That's enough, Mr. Blackwood," a new voice cut through the tension. Emily turned to see a striking woman in her early 40s striding towards them, her posture radiating authority. The woman's gaze softened as she looked at Emily. "Are you all right, dear?" Before Emily could respond, Mr. Blackwood interjected, "Catherine, you can't be serious. This girl has ruined my evening, not to mention my suit. She should be fired immediately." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Is that so, Richard? And tell me, how many restaurants have you been banned from for your boorish behavior? Shall we add Luigi's to that growing list?" Richard Blackwood's face reddened, a vein throbbing in his temple. "Do you know who I am? I could buy and sell this place 10 times over." "And yet," Catherine replied coolly, "you can't seem to buy basic human decency. Now, I suggest you leave before you embarrass yourself further." As security discreetly approached, Richard grabbed his coat and stormed out, but not before fixing Emily with a glare that chilled her to the bone. "This isn't over," he hissed. In the aftermath of Richard's departure, Catherine turned to Emily, who was fighting back tears. "Come with me, dear," she said gently, leading Emily away from the prying eyes of the other diners. In a quiet corner of the restaurant, Catherine handed Emily a tissue. "Don't let men like Richard Blackwood dim your light," she said. "I've known him for years, and believe me, his wealth can't mask the poverty of his character." Emily dabbed at her eyes. "Thank you, ma'am, but I'm sure I'll be fired for this. And I really need this job. My mother, she's sick, and the medical bills." Catherine's eyes widened in recognition. "Wait a moment. Thompson, did you say your name was?" "Emily Thompson?" Emily nodded, confused. A slow smile spread across Catherine's face. "Oh, my dear girl. I think it's time we had a long talk. There's something you need to know about your mother, and about yourself." As Catherine began to speak, Emily felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Little did she know, this disastrous evening was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. Catherine's eyes held a mixture of compassion and excitement as she gazed at Emily. The young waitress, still reeling from the confrontation with Richard Blackwood, felt a strange stirring in her heart, as if she stood on the precipice of a life-changing revelation. "Emily," Catherine began, her voice soft but charged with emotion, "what I'm about to tell you may come as a shock. But I need you to listen carefully and keep an open mind. Can you do that for me?" Emily nodded, her blue eyes wide with anticipation and a hint of fear. "Yes, ma'am. I'm listening." Catherine took a deep breath. 25 years ago, I had a best friend named Sarah Thompson. We were like sisters, inseparable since childhood. Sarah was a vibrant, beautiful soul with a heart of gold, much like you. But she fell in love with a man who didn't deserve her, Richard Blackwood. Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Richard Blackwood? The man who just—" "Yes, the very same," Catherine confirmed, her expression darkening. Back then, Richard was already ambitious and ruthless, but he hid it well behind a charming facade. Sarah was swept off her feet, and before long, she was pregnant. The pieces started to fall into place in Emily's mind, but she dared not interrupt as Catherine continued. When Richard found out about the pregnancy, he was furious. He had grand plans for his future, and a child didn't fit into them. He demanded that Sarah get rid of the baby. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she listened, her heart aching for a woman she'd never known. But Sarah refused, Catherine said, a note of pride in her voice. She was determined to keep her child, with or without Richard's support. When he realized he couldn't change her mind, he did something unforgivable. He framed Sarah for embezzlement at the company where they both worked, using his connections to make the charges stick. Emily's hands clenched into fists, anger bubbling up inside her. How could he do such a thing? Catherine placed a comforting hand on Emily's arm. Richard Blackwood has always been capable of great cruelty when it serves his interests. Sarah was sentenced to 5 years in prison, her reputation in tatters. But even in her darkest hour, she never lost hope. She gave birth to a beautiful baby girl in prison, and for 3 months, she was allowed to keep her child with her. A tear slid down Emily's cheek as the weight of Catherine's words sank in. What happened to the baby? She whispered, though in her heart, she already knew the answer. Catherine's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Sarah knew she couldn't raise her daughter in prison. She wanted to give her child the best chance at life, so she made the hardest decision a mother could make. She asked me to find a loving family to adopt her baby girl. Emily's world tilted on its axis. Are you saying, am I? Catherine nodded, squeezing Emily's hand. Yes, Emily. You are Sarah Thompson's daughter. And Richard Blackwood, the man who just treated you so cruelly, is your biological father. The revelation hit Emily like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her legs weak, and Catherine quickly guided her to a nearby chair. The bustling restaurant around them faded into a distant hum as Emily's mind reeled with this new information. But my parents, Emily stammered. The Thompsons who raised me are wonderful people who loved you as their own, Catherine assured her. I personally vetted them before the adoption. They knew about Sarah's situation and agreed to keep her surname for you, hoping that one day you might reconnect with your birth mother. Emily's thoughts raced to her adoptive mother, lying in a hospital bed, fighting a losing battle against cancer. The woman who had loved and raised her, who Emily was working so hard to support. Does my mom know? I mean, my adoptive mom? Catherine nodded. Yes, she does. In fact, it was her idea to send you to work here at Luigi's. She knew I owned the restaurant and hoped I might recognize you. She wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of after she's gone. Fresh tears spilled down Emily's cheeks, a complex mix of emotions overwhelming her. Gratitude for the parents who had raised her, grief for the mother she'd never known, and a confusing tangle of feelings towards the father who had rejected her before she was even born. But wait, Emily said, a sudden thought occurring to her. If you knew who I was all along, why didn't you say anything sooner? Catherine sighed, regret etching lines on her elegant face. I wanted to, believe me. But I also wanted to get to know you as you are, without the weight of this knowledge influencing your behavior or our interactions. I needed to see if you had Sarah's spirit, her kindness, her resilience. And oh, Emily, you have all that and more. Emily's mind was spinning with questions. What happened to my birth mother? Is Sarah still alive? A shadow passed over Catherine's face. Sarah served her full sentence, never once losing faith that the truth would come out. When she was released, she was determined to clear her name and find you. But Richard, he used his influence to make sure she could never get a decent job, never rebuild her life. The last I heard from her was 5 years ago. She had uncovered evidence of Richard's crimes, evidence that could exonerate her and bring him down. But then she disappeared. Emily's heart clenched with a mixture of hope and dread. Disappeared? Do you think Richard? I don't know, Catherine admitted. I've been searching for her ever since, but it's as if she vanished into thin air. That's part of the reason I've maintained my connection to Richard's social circle all these years, hoping to uncover some clue about Sarah's whereabouts. As Emily struggled to process this flood of information, a commotion near the restaurant's entrance caught their attention. Richard Blackwood had returned, his face flushed with anger, a security guard trying in vain to block his path. "Catherine," he bellowed, striding towards them. "How dare you humiliate me like that? Do you have any idea what I could do to this establishment, to you?" Catherine rose to her feet, positioning herself protectively in front of Emily. "I think it's time you left, Richard. For good." Richard's gaze flickered to Emily, and for a moment, something like recognition flashed in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by contempt. "And you," he sneered at Emily. "You'll never work in this city again. I'll make sure of it." Before Catherine could respond, Emily stood up, her legs shaky but her voice strong. "No, Mr. Blackwood. You won't." Richard's eyebrows shot up, clearly not expecting the show of defiance from the meek waitress he'd berated earlier. Emily took a deep breath, drawing strength from the truth she now knew. "You see, I know who you really are. I know what you did to Sarah Thompson all those years ago. And I promise you, I will not rest until the truth comes out and justice is served." Richard's face drained of color, his eyes darting between Emily and Catherine. "What is this? What game are you playing?" Catherine stepped forward, her voice cold. "It's no game, Richard. You're looking at Sarah Thompson's daughter. Your daughter." The restaurant fell silent, all eyes on the unfolding drama. Richard staggered back as if he'd been struck, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. That's impossible," he stammered. "You're lying. This is some sort of trick." Emily stood tall, channeling all the strength of the mother she'd never known and the parents who had raised her with love. "It's the truth, Mr. Blackwood. And I think it's time we had a long overdue conversation about the past, don't you?" As security guards approached to escort the shell-shocked Richard out of the restaurant, Catherine turned to Emily with pride shining in her eyes. "You truly are your mother's daughter," she said softly. Emily managed a small smile, though her heart was racing with the enormity of what had just transpired. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Catherine squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Now, my dear, we fight. We find your mother, we clear her name, and we make sure Richard Blackwood faces the consequences of his actions. It won't be easy, but you won't be alone. I promise you that." As the reality of her new situation sank in, Emily felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. Her life had changed irrevocably in the span of a single evening, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future. Little did Emily know, her journey was only just beginning. The coming days would test her in ways she could never have imagined, forcing her to confront not only the dark secrets of her past, but also the unexpected twists of her heart. As Emily left Luigi's that night, arm in arm with Catherine, she cast one last glance at the table where Richard Blackwood had sat. The wine stain on the white tablecloth seemed to mock her, a stark reminder of how quickly life could change. But Emily was no longer the timid waitress she had been just hours ago. She was Sarah Thompson's daughter, and she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The cool night air hit her face as they stepped outside, and Emily took a deep breath, feeling as if she were breathing freely for the first time in her life. The streets of New York stretched out before her, a labyrinth of possibilities and dangers. But with Catherine by her side and the fire of truth burning in her heart, Emily knew she could face anything. As they walked away from Luigi's, neither Emily nor Catherine noticed the sleek black car parked across the street, its tinted windows concealing the occupant who watched their every move with keen interest. Inside, a woman with streaks of gray in her once golden hair lowered a pair of binoculars, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Oh, my beautiful girl," Sarah Thompson whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I've found you at last." The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the tumultuous events of the previous night. Emily awoke in Catherine's guest room, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. As the memories of the evening before came flooding back, she sat up abruptly, her heart pounding. It hadn't been a dream. She really was the long-lost daughter of Sarah Thompson and Richard Blackwood. The truth of her origins, hidden for so long, now lay exposed like a raw nerve. A soft knock at the door pulled Emily from her reverie. "Come in," she called, her voice still husky with sleep. Catherine entered, carrying a tray laden with coffee and breakfast. Her silk robe rustled as she moved, a picture of elegance even in the early morning hours. "Good morning, Emily. I thought you might be hungry." Emily managed a small smile, gratitude warming her heart. "Thank you, Catherine, for everything." As they sat together, sipping coffee and picking at pastries, Catherine outlined their plan of action. "I've already contacted my lawyer," she explained. "We're going to file for a DNA test to officially establish your parentage. Once we have that, we can start the process of clearing Sarah's name." Emily nodded, her mind whirling with the implications. "And what about him? Richard?" Catherine's expression hardened. "Richard Blackwood is a powerful man with many influential friends. But he's not invincible. The evidence Sarah uncovered before she disappeared, if we can find it, it could bring down his entire empire." A thought occurred to Emily, sending a chill down her spine. "Catherine, do you think, could Richard have done something to my mother? To keep her quiet?" The older woman's hesitation spoke volumes. "I don't know, Emily. I pray that's not the case, but we have to be prepared for any possibility. Richard has always been ruthless in protecting his interests." As they discussed their next steps, Emily's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Her heart sank as she recognized the number of the hospital where her adoptive mother was being treated. "Hello?" she answered, her voice trembling slightly. The news was not good. Her mother's condition had taken a turn for the worse overnight. The doctors were recommending that family members come to the hospital as soon as possible. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she relayed the information to Catherine. "I have to go to her," she said, already rising to her feet. "She's been my mom in every way that matters. I can't let her." "Of course," Catherine agreed, squeezing Emily's hand. "I'll drive you there myself. Your mother is a remarkable woman, Emily. She deserves to know that her plan worked, that you've discovered the truth about your birth parents." As they rushed to the hospital, Emily's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Joy at having found a connection to her birth mother warred with the grief of potentially losing the woman who had raised her. And underneath it all, a simmering anger towards Richard Blackwood, the man whose selfish actions had set this whole tragic story in motion. They arrived at the hospital to find Emily's adoptive father, Robert, pacing anxiously in the hallway outside his wife's room. His face, lined with worry and lack of sleep, lit up with relief at the sight of Emily. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, enveloping her in a tight hug. "I'm so glad you're here. Your mom's been asking for you." As Emily moved to enter the room, Robert's gaze fell on Catherine. Recognition dawned in his eyes. "You must be Catherine," he said softly. "Linda told me she'd arranged for Emily to work at your restaurant. I guess the truth is out now?" Catherine nodded, her eyes kind. "Yes, Mr. Thompson. Emily knows everything. And I want you to know how grateful I am for the love and care you've given her all these years." Robert's eyes welled with tears. "We've been blessed to have her as our daughter. Nothing will ever change that." Inside the hospital room, the steady beep of monitors filled the air. Linda Thompson lay in the bed, her once vibrant form now frail and pale. But as Emily approached, her eyes opened, and a weak smile spread across her face. "My sweet girl," Linda whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. "You're here." Emily took her mother's hand, pressing it gently to her cheek. "I'm here, Mom. I'm not going anywhere." Linda's gaze drifted to Catherine, standing respectfully in the doorway. Understanding passed between the two women, and Linda's smile grew wider. "You know," she said to Emily. "You know about Sarah." Emily nodded, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "Yes, Mom. I know everything. But it doesn't change how I feel about you and Dad. You're my parents, no matter what." A look of peace settled over Linda's features. "I'm so glad," she murmured. "I've carried this secret for so long, always wondering if we'd done the right thing. But seeing you now, the strong, beautiful woman you've become, I know we made the right choice." As mother and daughter shared this poignant moment, none of them noticed the figure that paused briefly outside the hospital room door. Sarah Thompson, her heart breaking at the scene before her, slipped away unseen, her resolve strengthened by the glimpse of the daughter she'd given up so long ago. Back in his opulent penthouse office, Richard Blackwood paced like a caged animal. The events of the previous night had shaken him to his core. How could this be happening? After all these years, all the precautions he'd taken, how could his past come back to haunt him like this? His assistant, a nervous young man named Jason, entered the office cautiously. "Mr. Blackwood? I have the information you requested on Emily Thompson." Richard snatched the file from Jason's hands, rifling through the contents with growing agitation. Birth certificate, school records, employment history, it was all there, painting a picture of the life his daughter had lived without him. "And what about Sarah?" he barked. "Any sign of her?" Jason shook his head. "Nothing concrete, sir. There have been a few possible sightings over the years, but nothing we could confirm. It's like she vanished into thin air after she was released from prison." Richard slammed the file down on his desk, causing Jason to jump. "She's out there somewhere," he growled. "And now she's made her move, using that girl to get to me. Well, I won't let it happen. I've worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let them destroy everything I've built." As Jason scurried from the office, Richard turned to gaze out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. The sprawling cityscape of New York spread out before him like a kingdom he'd built with his own hands. But for the first time in years, he felt the foundations of that kingdom trembling beneath his feet. His mind raced with possibilities, each more desperate than the last. He could use his connections to discredit Emily, to paint her as a gold digger or a fraud. He could leverage his influence to bury any investigation before it even began. But deep down, Richard knew that none of these options would truly solve his problem. As long as Sarah was out there, as long as Emily knew the truth, his carefully constructed world was in danger of crumbling. Meanwhile, across town, Emily sat vigil at her adoptive mother's bedside. Linda's condition had stabilized somewhat, but the doctors warned that her time was limited. As Emily held her mother's frail hand, she felt torn between two worlds, the one she'd always known, filled with the love of the parents who had raised her, and the new, uncertain future that awaited her as Sarah Thompson's daughter. Robert Thompson entered the room, his face etched with worry and exhaustion. He placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "Sweetheart, there's someone here to see you." A detective. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Had Richard already made his move? Was he trying to intimidate her into silence? With a reassuring squeeze of Linda's hand, she rose and followed her father out into the hallway. The man waiting for her was not what she expected. Detective Michael Reeves was in his late 40s, with kind eyes that seemed at odds with his weathered face and the gun holstered at his hip. He extended a hand to Emily, his grip firm and reassuring. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm sorry to bother you at a time like this, but I have some information that I think you need to hear." Emily's mind raced. "Is this about Richard Blackwood? Or my birth mother?" Detective Reeves nodded solemnly. "Both, actually. I've been working on your mother's case for years, Miss Thompson. Off the books, you understand. The official investigation was closed long ago, but some things just don't sit right with a man even after all this time." He pulled out a worn leather notebook, flipping it open to reveal pages of cramped handwriting and newspaper clippings. "Your mother, Sarah Thompson, she didn't just disappear 5 years ago. She went into hiding, and for good reason. She had uncovered evidence of Richard Blackwood's crimes, not just the embezzlement he framed her for, but a whole web of corruption, bribery, and even darker deeds." Emily's legs felt weak, and she leaned against the wall for support. But if she had evidence, why didn't she come forward? Why stay in hiding all this time? Detective Reeves' expression darkened. "Because Blackwood has eyes and ears everywhere, Miss Thompson. Your mother knew that if she surfaced too soon, before she had ironclad proof and the right allies, she'd be silenced for good. So she bided her time, gathering more evidence, waiting for the right moment." A wild hope blossomed in Emily's chest. "Are you saying, is my mother still alive?" The detective's eyes softened. "I believe she is. In fact, I have reason to think she's here in New York, right now. She's been watching you, Miss Thompson, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself." Tears sprang to Emily's eyes, a mixture of joy and disbelief. "But why now? Why didn't she come to me sooner?" "Because now, you're in a position to help bring Blackwood down," Reeves explained. "Your confrontation with him at the restaurant, your connection to Catherine Maxwell, it's all part of a plan that's been years in the making." As Emily struggled to process this information, a commotion down the hall caught their attention. A woman's voice, raised in desperation, carried to where they stood. "Please, I need to see her. You don't understand, she's my daughter." Emily's heart leapt into her throat. She knew that voice, though she'd never heard it before. Without thinking, she broke into a run, rounding the corner to see a security guard restraining a woman with graying blonde hair and eyes that mirrored her own. "Mom?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah Thompson's struggles ceased instantly, her gaze locking onto Emily's face. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still as mother and daughter beheld each other for the first time in over 2 decades. Then, as if a dam had broken, they rushed into each other's arms, tears flowing freely as years of separation and longing poured out in a flood of emotion. "Oh, my beautiful girl," Sarah sobbed, cradling Emily's face in her hands. "I've dreamed of this moment for so long. Can you ever forgive me for staying away?" Emily could only nod, too overwhelmed for words. As they clung to each other, Detective Reeves approached, gently clearing his throat. "I hate to interrupt," he said, "but we need to move quickly. If Sarah's blown her cover, it won't take long for Blackwood to find out she's here." The gravity of the situation snapped Emily back to reality. She turned to the detective, her jaw set with determination. "What do we need to do?" Over the next few hours, a plan began to take shape. Sarah produced a flash drive containing years of meticulously gathered evidence, financial records, emails, and recorded conversations that painted a damning picture of Richard Blackwood's criminal empire. Catherine arrived at the hospital, bringing with her a team of lawyers and digital forensics experts. As they pored over Sarah's evidence, Emily found herself torn between the unfolding drama and her vigil at Linda's bedside. It was during one of these quiet moments with her adoptive mother that Linda's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Emily with surprising clarity. "You found her," Linda whispered, a smile touching her lips. "Your real mother." Emily squeezed her hand. "You're my real mother too," she insisted. "Both of you are." Linda's smile widened. "I always knew this day would come. I'm so glad I lived to see it." Her voice grew fainter, her eyes drifting closed. "Be happy, my sweet girl. Be happy." As the monitors began to wail, Emily felt her heart shatter and mend in the same instant. Linda Thompson, the woman who had loved her as her own, had slipped away. But in her final moments, she had given Emily one last gift, her blessing to embrace the truth of her origins. In the midst of grief, events continued to unfold at a dizzying pace. Detective Reeves, working with Catherine's legal team, prepared to present their evidence to the district attorney. Sarah, after a tearful reunion with Robert Thompson, threw herself into the task of organizing her years of research. But Richard Blackwood was not about to go down without a fight. As news of Sarah's reappearance reached him, he set in motion a desperate plan to discredit her and destroy the evidence before it could be used against him. Late one night, as Emily and Sarah worked side by side in Catherine's home office, the sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet. Men in black tactical gear swarmed into the room, their faces hidden behind masks. Emily's heart pounded as she was roughly grabbed and restrained. She could hear Sarah's muffled cries from across the room. As one of the intruders rifled through the papers on the desk, Emily caught a glimpse of familiar steel-gray eyes behind the mask. Richard Blackwood had come to silence them himself. Just when all seemed lost, the room erupted in chaos. Detective Reeves burst in, gun drawn, followed by a team of police officers. In the ensuing struggle, Richard's mask was torn away, revealing his face contorted with rage and fear. "It's over, Blackwood," Reeves growled, slapping handcuffs onto the once powerful businessman. "Your empire's coming down, and this time, you're going down with it." As Richard was led away, his eyes met Emily's. For a brief moment, she saw something flicker in their depths: regret? Sorrow? But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, hard mask he'd worn for so many years. In the days that followed, the Blackwood scandal dominated the headlines. Years of corruption were laid bare, and one by one, Richard's co-conspirators fell like dominoes. Sarah Thompson, once vilified as a criminal, was hailed as a hero for her years of dedication to uncovering the truth. Emily found herself at the center of a media storm, her face splashed across newspapers and TV screens as the long-lost daughter who had helped bring down one of New York's most powerful men. But amidst the chaos, she found moments of quiet joy, getting to know Sarah, grieving for Linda with Robert, and slowly building a new kind of family that bridged her past and her future. One crisp autumn morning, Emily stood between Sarah and Robert at Linda's graveside. As she placed a bouquet of lilies, Linda's favorite, on the fresh earth, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. "She would be so proud of you," Robert said, his arm around Emily's shoulders. Sarah nodded in agreement, wiping away a tear. "I can never thank her enough for giving you the love I couldn't. For keeping you safe when I couldn't be there." Emily took both their hands in hers, feeling the connection between her two worlds. "She knew," she said softly. "In the end, she knew that loving me meant letting me find my way back to you, Mom. And she was happy for us." As they turned to leave the cemetery, Emily caught sight of a familiar figure waiting by the gates. Catherine stood there, a gentle smile on her face, a silent guardian who had helped make this reunion possible. Emily's heart swelled with gratitude for all the people who had played a part in her journey: Linda and Robert, who had given her a loving home; Sarah, who had sacrificed everything to protect her; Catherine, who had been the bridge between her past and present; and even Richard, whose actions had set in motion the events that led her to this moment. Epilogue. 1 year later. The Manhattan skyline glittered in the distance as Emily stood on the balcony of her new apartment, a cup of coffee warming her hands in the cool evening air. So much had changed in the past year, it sometimes felt like a dream. Sarah had been fully exonerated, her name cleared of all charges. She'd used her share of the settlement from Richard's seized assets to start a foundation supporting children of incarcerated parents, with Emily by her side as co-director. Robert had moved into a smaller house, but he remained a constant presence in Emily's life, a beloved father figure who had embraced Sarah's return with remarkable grace. Catherine had sold Luigi's, focusing instead on using her influence and resources to support criminal justice reform. She and Sarah had formed an unlikely but powerful friendship, united by their shared love for Emily. And Richard? He was serving a lengthy prison sentence, his empire dismantled, his name now synonymous with corruption and greed. Emily had visited him once, seeking closure. The man she found behind the bulletproof glass was a shadow of the imposing figure who had once terrified her, his arrogance replaced by a hollow-eyed despair. "I never wanted children," he told her, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought they would hold me back, keep me from achieving greatness. But looking at you now, I realize that you were the greatest thing I could have ever been a part of. And I threw it all away." Emily had left that visit with a mix of pity and resolve. She couldn't forgive Richard, not yet, maybe not ever, but she could learn from his mistakes. She vowed to live her life with compassion, to value love and integrity over power and wealth. A knock at the door pulled Emily from her reverie. She smiled, knowing who it would be. Sure enough, when she opened it, she found Michael Reeves standing there, looking far more relaxed in jeans and a leather jacket than he ever had as a detective. "Ready for dinner?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made Emily's heart skip a beat. Their relationship had developed slowly, cautiously, in the aftermath of the scandal. Michael had been a rock for Emily throughout the tumultuous events, and somewhere along the way, their connection had deepened into something more. As they walked hand in hand to their favorite little Italian restaurant, not Luigi's, but a cozy place that reminded Emily of where her journey had begun, she marveled at the twists and turns that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a humble waitress, humiliated and downtrodden. She had uncovered painful truths, faced daunting challenges, and emerged stronger for it all. She had lost one mother and found another, expanded her family in ways she never could have imagined. But most importantly, Emily Thompson had discovered her own strength, her own voice. She was no longer defined by the actions of others, not Richard's cruelty, not Sarah's absence, not even Linda and Robert's love. She was her own woman, shaped by all these experiences but not limited by them. As she and Michael settled into their usual table, Emily caught sight of their reflection in the restaurant's window. She saw a woman who had been tested by fire and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. A woman who had learned that true wealth lay not in bank accounts or social status, but in the bonds of love and loyalty that had seen her through her darkest hours. The waitress approached their table, pad in hand, and Emily felt a surge of empathy for the young woman. She remembered all too well the anxiety of trying to please demanding customers, the fear of making a mistake. "Take your time," Emily said kindly. "We're in no rush." As the waitress smiled gratefully and moved away, Michael reached across the table to take Emily's hand. "You never cease to amaze me," he said softly. "After everything you've been through, you still have so much compassion for others." Emily squeezed his hand, her heart full. "I've learned that everyone has a story," she replied. "Everyone is fighting battles we know nothing about. The least we can do is treat each other with kindness." As they settled into conversation, discussing their days and their dreams for the future, Emily felt a profound sense of contentment wash over her. Her journey had been long and often painful, but it had led her here, to a place of love, purpose, and inner peace. She thought of Sarah, probably working late at the foundation, of Robert, likely tending to his beloved garden, of Catherine, no doubt strategizing her next philanthropic venture. She thought of Linda, watching over them all from wherever she was now. And yes, she even spared a thought for Richard, hoping that someday he might find redemption. All of these people, for better or worse, had shaped her into the woman she was today. And as she sat across from Michael, his warm gaze filled with love and admiration, Emily knew that she wouldn't change a single step of her journey. For this was her triumph, not over Richard, or adversity, or even her own past. Her true triumph was in learning to embrace all parts of herself, in finding the strength to forgive, and in choosing, every day, to meet the world with an open heart and a determination to make it a little bit better. As the evening wore on, filled with laughter, good food, and plans for the future, Emily Thompson, daughter, friend, survivor, and now, agent of change, knew that her story was far from over. But whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them, armed with the love of her family, the strength of her convictions, and the unshakable knowledge that she was, at last, exactly where she was meant to be.